When darkness held dominion over Middle-earth, one being rose above all others in Morgoth's service, a demon whose very presence melted stone and whose power brought kingdoms to ruin. Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, carved his legacy into the world through fire and death. His burning whip and black axe took the high kings of the Noldor. His command broke the greatest siege in history, and his final battle shook the foundations of a hidden city. This is the tale of Gothmog, the mightiest of all Balrogs. Before the breaking of Arda's first dawn, when the music of the Ainur still echoed in the void, Gothmog existed as one of the Maia, divine spirits who would later help shape the physical world. In those earliest days, he served in the celestial halls alongside other Maia and Valar, joining in the great music that would become the vision of all that was to come. But when Melkor wove his discord into the music of creation, his darker melody carried promises of unfettered might, of power beyond the constraints of harmony and order. Among all those who heard, Gothmog was one of the first to be seduced by its promise. He turned willingly to Melkor's service, abandoning the harmonies of creation for the discordant themes of destruction. Where once he had helped create, now he yearned to destroy. The Valar descended into Arda to build the world anew. While his brethren worked to shape Middle-earth according to the vision of the music, Melkor broke away from their great labor. In the far northern wastes beyond the light of the lamp Iluin, he delved deep into the Iron Mountains to build his first great fortress of Utumno. Following his new master, Gothmog descended from the celestial halls into those lightless depths. There, within Utumno's black halls, he underwent his transformation. His divine form twisted and grew until he towered twice the height of the tallest elf warriors who would later walk Middle-earth. Dark fire erupted from within, while shadows cloaked him like a second skin. The very air around him turned to shimmering waves, and his footsteps left pools of molten stone. From this fusion of shadow and flame came his weapons, a black axe forged in the fires of his own body, and a whip whose burning thongs could reduce armor to slag. Other Maia followed him into darkness, drawn by his display of raw power. These fallen spirits underwent similar transformations, each becoming a demon of shadow and flame. Under Gothmog's command, their daily practices shook the foundations of Utumno. When they clashed in training, the impact of shadow meeting shadow made the Iron Mountains tremble. Each display of their growing power filled Gothmog with dark satisfaction. The other Balrogs would instinctively follow his lead, quieting their flames in his presence. Melkor recognized his lieutenant's pride and named him Lord of Balrogs, a title that sent waves of pleasure through his shadowed form. After Melkor destroyed the two lamps and forced the Valar's retreat to Aman, Utumno remained a stronghold of darkness through the years of the trees. It was during this age that the first elves awakened at Cuiviénen, providing new victims for Melkor's cruel designs. While the Balrogs reveled in their might above, in the deepest dungeons below, the screams of captured elves echoed through the corridors. The firstborn children of Ilúvatar, taken from their lands, now subject to Melkor's cruelest torments. The mere sight of Balrogs passing through these chambers would stop the prisoners' hearts through sheer terror. After several such incidents, Gothmog forbade his kind from entering the torture chambers. Melkor's grand design to transform these elves into orcs required them alive, and the Lord of Balrogs would not let his brethren interfere with their master's absolute will. But the price of such evil would not go unpaid. For over 40 Valian years, evil grew unchecked in Utumno's depths, until the screams of tormented elves could no longer be ignored. Then, in an hour when shadow lay deepest across Middle-earth, the host of the Valar descended upon Utumno with overwhelming force. Tulkas and Orome led the vanguard, their divine power burning away shadows and shattering stone. Before Melkor's throne, Gothmog and his Balrogs formed a burning line. The Lord of Balrog stood at their center, knowing the might of the Valar would test them as never before, yet confident that no single warrior in their host could match his power. The host of the Valar smashed through Utumno's outer armies like a tide of light through darkness. Level by level they descended, their radiance turning black halls golden, until they reached the deepest chamber where Melkor's throne stood. There they found the Balrogs waiting, their flames casting twisted shadows across the ancient stone. Here, the Lord of Balrogs would watch in fury as Tulkas himself tore through their defenses like lightning through storm clouds, the Valar's strength making mockery of their terrible flames. One by one, the Balrogs fell before the Valar's might. Their shadows, which had known no defeat since the music of creation, were stripped away by divine light. Their whips of flame crumbled to ash before powers older than Arda itself. Tulkas strode through their ranks, his divine strength shattering their defenses until only Gothmog remained, the last barrier before Melkor's throne. Gothmog's black axe struck against Tulkas' advance, each impact releasing bursts of flame that illuminated the chamber like false dawns. The Valar pressed forward through the inferno, his divine light cutting through. Gothmog's whip lashed out in desperation, its burning thongs wrapping around pillars and shattering them to molten fragments, yet still, Tulkas came on. The Lord of Balrogs gathered his remaining strength for one final assault. He launched himself at Tulkas, his axe raised high, shadow and flame concentrated into a single devastating strike. But the Valar met his charge with ease, divine power crashing through Gothmog's defenses like a wave-breaking stone. The Lord of Balrogs crashed before his master's throne, his shadow scattered and flames dimmed. With Gothmog defeated, nothing stood between the Valar and their quarry. Tulkas himself wrestled Melkor to the ground in his own throne room, binding the Dark Lord with the great chain Angband. Gothmog could only watch in helpless rage as they dragged his master away to face judgment in the west. While Sauron vanished into the vastness of Middle-earth to gather forces and maintain Angband's dominion, for this mighty fortress beneath the Iron Mountains was Melkor's last stronghold in Middle-earth. Gothmog and his surviving Balrogs withdrew into the deepest pits beneath. There, in the lightless chambers below, these demons of shadow and flame would nurse both their wounds and their hatred, their flames burning low but never dying, as they waited through the long ages in darkness. The Valar would keep Melkor chained in the halls of Mandos under their vigilant watch, but they could only do so for so long. In the year 1495 of the Trees, after 3 ages of imprisonment, Melkor won his freedom through displays of remorse that moved even the Valar to mercy. He walked freely in Valinor, though the chain Angband had left its mark. Yet his heart had not changed. For 50 years he waited and planned, until at last he found his ally, Ungoliant, the great darkness that took the form of a terrifying spider. Together they struck at the heart of the Blessed Realm during a great feast, destroying the 2 trees and stealing the Silmarils from Feanor's vault. Under cover of the darkness they had wrought, they fled north across the grinding ice to Middle-earth. Then, in the frozen wastes of Lammoth, Ungoliant turned. Her webs of darkness wrapped around Melkor like living shadows, her hunger vast and terrible after consuming the light of the 2 trees. The Dark Lord who had dared steal from Valinor now found himself at the mercy of his own allies' endless appetite. His cry of desperation thundered across the northern wastes, shaking the mountains to their roots. Deep in the fortress of Angband, where Gothmog and his Balrogs had hidden for nearly 4,000 years, that cry penetrated the deepest chambers. The Lord of Balrogs led his forces forth like a storm of fire, their flames lighting up the night sky as they raced across the plain. The ground cracked and smoldered beneath their feet as they charged to their master's aid. Racing north through the frozen wastes, they followed their master's cry until they reached the jagged peaks of Lammoth. There they found their quarry. Ungoliant's massive form loomed over Melkor, her darkness deeper than any natural shadow. Gothmog struck first, his whip of flame slicing through her webs like a blazing knife. The other Balrogs followed his lead, their heat searing away her darkness layer by layer until she turned and fled south, her appetite finally overwhelmed by their burning fury. Gothmog led them back to Angband, his flames burning brighter with each step. Thousands years of waiting had not dimmed his loyalty. If anything, the long vigil had only strengthened it. Melkor's presence filled the ancient halls once more, and with him came the promise of war. The Lord of Balrog's flames roared higher at the prospect of battle, his shadow dancing against Angband's walls. At last, their fires would spread across Middle-earth again. Melkor named him High Captain of Angband's armies, though Gothmog cared little for titles. What mattered was that the time for hiding had ended. The next war would begin sooner than even Gothmog expected. Feanor crossed the sea with an army of Noldor, burning with vengeance and desire for his treasures. This first host of the Noldor made landfall at Lake Mithrin. Morgoth would send his armies to crush them before they could establish a foothold. But the elves, still bright with the light of Valinor in their eyes, cut through the orc host like a scythe through wheat. Their victory was absolute. Yet in his battle fury, Feanor drove his forces onward, pursuing the fleeing orcs across the plains of Ardgarlan toward Angband itself. Gothmog seized his chance. The gates of Angband burst open, releasing a tide of shadow and flame. Balrogs poured forth. They moved with practiced coordination, encircling Feanor's small band of guards. The trap closed with devastating precision. The High King's sword blazed in the darkness, each strike leaving trails of light where it cut through shadow. His armor glowed red-hot under the Balrog's assault, yet he fought on. Gothmog's burning whip struck again and again, each hit raising clouds of steam where it met Feanor's damaged armor. The Lord of Balrogs pressed forward through his own flames, black axe raised high. The weapon came down with crushing force, shattering Feanor's guard and sending the High King crashing to the scorched earth. Only the timely arrival of Feanor's sons prevented Gothmog from claiming his prey immediately. But mortal wounds had been dealt. The mightiest of all the Noldor, whose hands had crafted the Silmarils themselves, lay broken upon that blasted plain. Gothmog watched as Feanor's sons carried their father away. The High King's armor still smoldered from the Balrog's flames, his once bright sword now dulled and warped from the heat. Gothmog's black axe had drawn its first royal blood, and he knew Feanor would not last the night. The sons' cries of rage, but Gothmog felt no fear of their threats. In the depths of Angband, Melkor too withdrew to gather his strength. The destruction of the two trees and the power required to wrest the Silmarils from Feanor's vault had diminished him. Gothmog would wait patiently in the dark halls as his master spoke of new creatures to be bred in Angband's depths. For nearly 400 years after Feanor's death, the Noldor maintained an iron grip around Angband. They built mighty fortresses encircling the Iron Mountains, determined to keep Morgoth contained and perhaps one day reclaim the Silmarils. These were years of watchful peace when elven kingdoms flourished across Beleriand. Their towers rose high and their songs echoed far, while Morgoth's forces could do little but hide behind the peaks of Thangorodrim. But in the depths of his fortress, the Dark Lord was far from idle. Between Angband and the Elven realms stretched Ardgarlan, a vast plain of green grass that rippled like an ocean in the northern winds. For centuries, this verdant expanse had served as a natural boundary between light and darkness, its open terrain making it impossible for Morgoth's forces to move undetected. Then, in the year 455 of the First Age, the mountains themselves split open. Rivers of fire burst forth from Thangorodrim's roots, turning the endless green of Ardgarlan into an inferno. Through gates wreathed in smoke, Gothmog and his Balrogs erupted from Angband, spreading out in a wave of shadow and flame. Behind them came Glaurung, first of the fire drakes, now fully grown and armored in golden scales. Vast armies of orcs followed in their wake, protected from the flames by paths that Gothmog's forces carved through the burning landscape. Elven warriors who had never seen such horrors froze in their ranks. Shields dropped from trembling hands as Glaurung's massive form emerged through the smoke, his golden scales gleaming in the firelight. When he opened his jaws, his flames put even the Balrog's fires to shame, turning entire formations to ash in a single breath. At this sight, Gothmog's shadow dancing with savage joy against the smoke-filled sky. Centuries-old battle formations crumbled at the sight of the approaching demons of shadow and flame. Elven armies that had stood firm for centuries broke and scattered. The burning plains offered no retreat, as fires consumed everything in their path. The plains of Ardgarlan, renamed Anfauglith, the gasping dust. Where once green grass had waved in the wind, now only ash and broken stone remained. No rain would ever again bring life to soil scorched by the fire of Glaurung and Balrogs. For the next 17 years, Gothmog's armies patrolled the blackened wastes of Anfauglith. Then, in the year 472 of the First Age, Morgoth's scouts brought word. Armies were gathering in the west. Elves, men, and dwarves united in numbers never before seen in Middle-earth. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad began as the greatest alliance of elves, men, and dwarves ever assembled. Their combined armies stretched across the plain of Anfauglith, banners snapping in the wind, armor gleaming under the sun. But Gothmog had prepared for this moment. Hidden armies waited in the mountains, while dragons lurked in shadowed valleys. The Lord of Balrogs would now transform the battlefield into an elaborate trap. The western host engaged, and Gothmog unleashed his counterattack. A force triple the size of anything the Noldor had faced before erupted from hidden positions. Great dragons crawled forth from their hiding places, while Balrogs struck at key points in the enemy lines, their flames turning formation after formation into chaos. On the battlefield's eastern flank, High King Fingon led a desperate countercharge. His blade flashed in the smoke-filled air as he cut through the orcs and lesser dragons. The Lord of Balrogs turned to meet this challenge, his flames roaring higher at the sight of elven royalty. Their weapons met in a clash that sent shockwaves across the field. But even as Fingon matched Gothmog blow for blow, another Balrog circled behind. Its whip of flame wrapped around the High King's legs, binding him in place. Gothmog seized his moment. His black axe swept down in a burning arc, splitting Fingon's helm and crown in a single stroke. The High King's body was beaten into the mud until his blue and silver banner was soaked with blood. At last, Fingon stood alone with his guard dead about him, and he fought with Gothmog until another Balrog came behind and cast a thong of fire about him. Then Gothmog hewed him with his black axe, and a white flame sprang up from the helm of Fingon as it was cloven. Thus fell the High King of the Noldor, and they beat him into the dust with their maces, and his banner, blue and silver, they trod into the mire of his blood. Across Anfauglith, the sight of their fallen king shattered the allies' resolve. Entire companies threw down their weapons and fled. The rout became total. The greatest alliance of elves, men, and dwarves broke before Gothmog's onslaught. In the wake of this devastating defeat, only few realms of the Noldor remained defiant. Among them stood Gondolin. The hidden city of Gondolin remained a jewel untouched by darkness, its towers reaching the sky like fingers of hope in a world dominated by shadow. Since its inception, its location remained secret, protected by encircling mountains and powerful enchantments. In the year 495, Meglin, nephew to King Turgon and a lord of Gondolin itself, betrayed his people. Captured while mining outside the city's bounds, he revealed Gondolin's location to Morgoth in exchange for promises of power and the hand of Turgon's daughter. When news of this betrayal reached Angband's war room, Gothmog's flames burned brighter with anticipation. The Lord of Balrogs demanded immediate assault. But Sauron counseled patience, warning that this could be another of Gondolin's deceptions. After all, no spy had ever found the hidden city in centuries. For years they waited, gathering forces while confirming Meglin's intelligence. Then, at midsummer of 510, as the people of Gondolin gathered awaiting dawn during the festival of Tarn in Auster, Morgoth finally gave the order. Ancient scrolls, collected in what scholars would call it the Book of Lost Tales, speak of a host of 1,000 Balrogs pouring forth from Angband that day, with hundreds riding upon the backs of dragons. Yet later, histories would reveal their count as no more than 7. Whatever their true numbers, the assault that followed would mark the tragic end of Gondolin. Dragons and Balrogs moved across the mountain passes as a tide of scales and fire. Siege engines crashed against the northern walls while Gothmog led the charge, his presence turning the winter air into waves of heat. The first defense tower collapsed within minutes. Through the breach, Gothmog strode into Gondolin's streets, turning the narrow paths into furnaces. Any defenders directly in his path simply vanished. In the square of the king, Ecthelion of the Fountain stood waiting. Steam exploded where their weapons met, forming clouds that prevented either side's archers from targeting the duel. Having lost his sword, Ecthelion charged forward with desperate speed as Gothmog raised his whip for a killing blow. The spike of his helmet struck like a spear, piercing the Balrog lord's chest. Their momentum carried them both backward into the fountain's deep basin. Fire met water in a deafening blast. The fountain's contents turned instantly to scalding steam. The Lord of Balrogs thrashed in his death throes, his internal fires fighting against the quenching water. Ecthelion, weighed down by his armor, drowned alongside his mighty foe. The fountain that had been one of Gondolin's greatest beauties became their shared tomb. Then leapt Ecthelion, Lord of the Fountain, fairest of the Noldor, full at Gothmog, even as he raised his whip, and his helm that had a spike upon it he drave into that evil breast, and he twined his legs about his foeman's thighs, and the Balrog yelled and fell forward, but those two dropped into the basin of the king's fountain, which was very deep. There found that creature his bane, and Ecthelion sank steel-laden into the depths, and so perished. The death of their commander did not halt the Balrog's assault. They continued to burn their way through Gondolin's streets, but without his coordination, they missed crucial strategic targets in favor of random destruction. One more of their number would fall that day, dragged to death by Glorfindel on a mountain pass. The remaining Balrogs, their exact number unknown in the chaos, withdrew with the survivors of Morgoth's army once the city's destruction was complete. Perhaps the most curious echo of his influence emerged in the Third Age. Another, being named Gothmog, served as lieutenant in the armies of Mordor. This later Gothmog commanded Sauron's forces during the siege of Minas Tirith, though his true nature remained unclear. Some believed him a powerful orc chief or a black Númenórean lord. Others whispered he might be a lesser Maia corrupted by Sauron's influence, taking the ancient name of the Balrog Lord to inspire terror in his enemies. This shadow of a name was but a pale echo of the Lord of Balrogs, a candle's flame compared to a forest fire. For no later servant of evil would combine his tactical mastery with such overwhelming individual might. His way of war, direct, devastating, and absolutely committed, belonged to an age when greater powers walked Middle-earth, when dragons and Balrogs could turn entire kingdoms to ash. The name might have lived on, but the pure physical power it once represented remained locked in the First Age, as dead as the Lord of Balrogs himself.